Someone was slowly pulling the blanket off me at 2 in the morning, and for half a second, I honestly thought somebody had broken into the house. I opened my eyes and saw Emily standing beside my bed in the weak light coming through the blinds. Then she climbed onto the mattress and sat across my thighs before I could even understand what the hell was happening. She was wearing this thin silk nightgown that left very little to the imagination, and she leaned so close I could smell wine on her breath. "Your son's on the night shift tonight," she whispered. "Sarah's at her sister's. We're finally alone." I froze, not because I wanted her there, because my brain just stopped working. This was my son's wife, my daughter-in-law. She put one hand against my chest and smiled like we were sharing some private joke. "I'm tired of that boy, Joseph. Let's just do what we've both been thinking about for a month." I grabbed her wrist, moved her hand off me, and sat up so fast she nearly slid off the bed. "Get out!" She didn't look embarrassed. That was the part that scared me. She just stared at me with this calm little smile, like my answer didn't matter. And sitting there in my own bedroom, I finally understood that all those weird little moments from the previous month hadn't been accidents at all. I was 55 then, and until Emily moved into our house, my life was honestly pretty boring in the best possible way. I'd been married to Sarah for 30 years. We'd had rough years, good years, broke years, and eventually some very comfortable years. I owned a private building company, mostly residential work, additions, renovations, custom homes, that kind of thing. I wasn't some billionaire contractor driving around in a Lamborghini. I worked with the same crews for years, still showed up at job sites in work boots, and still got yelled at by Sarah when I tracked mud through the kitchen. But business had been good to us. We had a large house on a few acres, a detached garage, a backyard Sarah treated like a second child, and enough money that I finally wasn't checking my bank account before buying groceries. Our only son, Mark, had gotten married about 8 months earlier. He was 27, stubborn as hell, hard-working, and determined to prove he didn't need his parents paying for his life. I respected that. Maybe too much, because when he and Emily bought their first place, I kept my mouth shut even though I knew almost immediately they'd bought themselves a disaster. The cottage looked cute in the listing photos. That's how they got fooled. Fresh paint outside, little porch, decent yard, cheap enough that Mark thought he'd found a miracle. Then I went over there with him after closing and started looking properly. I pushed a screwdriver into the bottom of one window frame and it went straight through rotten wood. There was moisture behind 2 walls. The bathroom floor had started sagging around the tub, and whoever had worked on the electrical system before them apparently believed wire nuts were optional. I stood in the kitchen staring at a crack running halfway across the ceiling and said, "Son, please tell me you got an inspection." He rubbed both hands over his face. That told me everything. Emily was sitting at the counter with her laptop open, looking close to tears. Mark said, "Dad, don't start." I wasn't going to. He already knew. I walked around for another hour, made a rough list in my head, and realized they were looking at tens of thousands of dollars before that place was safe and comfortable. Mark had put almost everything he had into the down payment. So that night, I talked to Sarah, and we made what I thought was a completely normal family decision. I called Mark the next morning and said, "Move in with us for a few months." He immediately said no. Of course he did. I could practically hear his pride through the phone. "Dad, I'm married. I'm not moving my wife into my parents' house." I told him, "You're not 16, and I'm not giving you a curfew. You've got a bad roof section, rotten framing, plumbing work, electrical work, and a mortgage payment showing up whether that house is livable or not. Stop trying to impress me." He went quiet. Then he said, "I can handle it." I remember laughing and saying, "Yeah, you can. But handling it doesn't mean making it 10 times harder just so you can say you did it alone. Sarah got Emily on the phone later, and within 2 days, they agreed. We had 2 empty bedrooms upstairs and a bathroom they could basically have to themselves. I even cleared part of the garage so Mark could store tools and materials there. At the time, I felt good about it. Seriously, I thought this was one of those things you do for your kid and forget about 5 years later. I had no idea I was inviting a problem into my house that I wouldn't even know how to explain to my own wife. And during those first few days, there wasn't a single reason for me to suspect anything. Emily smiled, thanked us, unpacked their things, and acted like the perfect daughter-in-law. Looking back, that normal beginning was probably why I ignored the first warning signs for as long as I did. Mark made the whole arrangement harder on himself almost immediately, because that kid simply did not know when to stop working. He already had a full-time job at a fabrication shop, starting at 7 in the morning. But once he understood how much the renovation was going to cost, he picked up night shifts at a logistics warehouse 3 or 4 times a week. On those days, he'd leave our house around 6 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and wouldn't come back until close to midnight. Sometimes I'd hear his truck pull into the driveway while Sarah and I were already upstairs. He'd walk through the kitchen, looking half dead, grab whatever leftovers were in the refrigerator, and disappear into their room. One night, I caught him standing at the counter, eating cold chicken straight from the container because he was too tired to heat it. I said, "Mark, this is stupid. You're going to put yourself in the hospital." He shrugged and said, "Every extra shift buys drywall, Dad." That was how he thought. Mortgage, lumber, wiring, insulation. Everything became another shift. I offered to lend him money more than once, but he refused every time. "You already gave us a place to stay," he'd say. "I'm not taking your money too." Emily's schedule was completely different. She worked remotely doing some kind of account management job, and from what I could tell, most of it happened through email and video calls. I'm not saying she didn't work, she did, but she could sit on the patio with her laptop, disappear for lunch whenever she wanted, and finish most days before Mark even left the fabrication shop. At first, I actually thought the arrangement might be good for them. She handled groceries sometimes, helped Sarah around the house, and seemed genuinely grateful. She'd ask me questions about the renovation, and I'd explain what Mark and I were planning. "How much would all this cost if you weren't helping?" she asked me once. I gave her a rough number. Her eyebrows went up. "Seriously?" I laughed and said, "Welcome to construction." She looked around our kitchen after that, then through the glass doors toward the backyard and pool. This house must have cost a fortune. Something about the way she said it stuck with me, not enough to bother me then, but enough that I remembered it later. I just told her Sarah and I had worked a long time for it. Emily smiled and said, "Mark definitely got lucky with his parents." I answered, "We got lucky with him too." The first time she made me uncomfortable happened maybe 3 weeks after they moved in. Sarah had gone shopping with one of her friends. Mark was working, and I came home early from a job site because an inspection had been pushed to the next morning. I walked through the kitchen toward the garage, glanced through the back doors, and saw Emily lying beside the pool, sunbathing, topless. I immediately looked away. I wasn't shocked by nudity like some teenager. I'd been married 30 years, but this was my daughter-in-law in my backyard, and she knew perfectly well I could come home at any time. I opened the door just enough and called, "Emily!" She lifted her head like nothing was wrong. I kept my eyes toward the yard and said, "Could you put something on, please?" She laughed. "Joseph, seriously? It's just sunbathing." I said, "Yeah, and this is still my house." There was a pause, then she said, "Fine." Her tone sounded amused more than embarrassed. I went into the garage and stayed there for almost an hour. When I finally came back inside, she was in the kitchen wearing a robe, drinking water. She gave me this little smile and said, "Sorry if I traumatized you." I told her, "You didn't. Just don't do it again." She raised both hands like she was surrendering. "Yes, sir." I didn't tell Sarah. That decision bothered me later because it sounds suspicious when I say it out loud, but at the time, what was I supposed to say? "Your son's wife was sunbathing topless?" Emily had stopped when I asked. Turning it into some family meeting would have made everything weird, so I forgot about it or tried to. Then about a week later, something happened that I couldn't explain away nearly as easily. I'd gotten home filthy from a renovation job and went straight upstairs to shower. Sarah was at the grocery store. Mark was at work. I finished showering, wrapped a towel around my waist, and was standing at the sink, shaving the edge of my beard, when the bathroom door opened. Emily walked in. I jerked around and said, "Jesus, Emily." She didn't immediately leave. She stood there looking at me through the mirror. I said, "What are you doing?" She smiled and said, "I thought nobody was in here." I pointed toward the hallway. "Well, somebody is. Out." Instead of moving, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. That was the moment my stomach tightened. She leaned against the door and looked me up and down, without even pretending otherwise. I grabbed my shirt from the counter and held it in front of myself. "Emily, open the door." She tilted her head. "You're in pretty good shape for 55. I remember staring at her because I genuinely couldn't believe she'd said it. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Her smile disappeared for maybe half a second, then came right back. "Relax." It was a compliment. I stepped toward the door and said, "Move." She finally did, but slowly, making me reach past her for the handle. Before I opened it, she said, "You know, Mark doesn't have to know every stupid little thing that happens around here." I looked straight at her and said, "Nothing happened." She gave me that same strange smile. "Exactly." Then she walked away, like we'd just discussed the weather. I locked the bathroom door behind her and stood there staring at myself in the mirror. My hands were shaking slightly, which pissed me off more than anything. I was twice her age. She was married to my only son. There shouldn't have been anything complicated about this. I should have walked downstairs, called Mark, called Sarah, and told them exactly what had happened. Instead, I started arguing with myself. Maybe she was joking. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe telling Mark would destroy his marriage over something I couldn't prove. And underneath all of that was another thought I hated admitting. What if she denied it? What if Sarah looked at me differently afterward? What if my own son wondered why his wife felt comfortable saying something like that to his father? So I put my clothes on, went downstairs, and said nothing. Emily was sitting at the kitchen island, typing on her laptop when I passed. She didn't even look up, but just as I reached the garage door, I heard her say, "See you later, Joseph." The way she said my name made me stop for a second. That was when I knew the pool hadn't been an accident, the bathroom hadn't been an accident, and whatever game she was playing had only just started. After that bathroom thing, I started paying attention to details I probably would have ignored before. Emily had this weird ability to act completely normal whenever somebody else was around. If Sarah was in the kitchen, Emily was sweet, helpful, almost boring. If Mark was home, she'd sit beside him on the couch, rub his shoulder, ask about his day, bring him food. Watching them together actually made me question myself sometimes. I'd think maybe I misunderstood her. Then Mark would leave, Sarah would run an errand, and Emily would change. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made it worse. She'd stand closer when she talked to me. She'd hold eye contact a few seconds too long. Once, while I was making coffee, she reached around me for a mug, even though there were 6 others in the cabinet beside her. I stepped away and said, "Emily, enough." She just looked innocent. "Enough what?" I didn't answer. She knew exactly what I meant. That little smile appeared again, and I realized she enjoyed making me uncomfortable, because as long as she never crossed some obvious line in front of witnesses, I was the one stuck wondering how the hell to explain it. A few evenings later, Sarah went to help a friend prepare for some family party. Mark was doing another warehouse shift. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through invoices when Emily came downstairs wearing shorts that barely qualified as shorts and a loose tank top. I immediately lowered my eyes back to the paperwork. She opened the refrigerator, poured herself some water, then sat in the chair right beside me, even though the entire table was empty. "Joseph, can you do me a favor?" she asked. I said, "Depends." She rolled one shoulder and complained that sitting at her computer all day was killing her back. Then she turned slightly and said, "Could you massage my shoulders for a minute?" I actually laughed, because I thought she couldn't possibly be serious. She was. "No." She frowned. "Why not?" I put my pen down. "Because you have a husband." She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, it's a shoulder massage, not an affair." I told her, "Then ask Mark." She laughed under her breath. "Mark? He comes home and falls asleep before his head hits the pillow. You can't count on him for anything lately." That pissed me off. Not because she'd asked me to touch her, because of how casually she insulted my son while he was working himself into the ground trying to fix the house they had bought together. I turned toward her and said, "That boy leaves here before sunrise and comes back close to midnight because he's trying to build a life with you. So don't sit in my kitchen and talk about him like he's useless." Her face changed. The playful expression disappeared. She stared at me for a few seconds, then said, "You always defend him." I said, "He's my son." She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "He's not you, though." I pushed my chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. "Stop," she smiled again. I didn't say anything. I stood up, gathered my invoices, and told her, "Start behaving like my son's wife, instead of testing how much crap I'm willing to ignore." For once, she didn't have a quick answer. I walked toward the garage, and right before I closed the door, I heard her laugh softly behind me. From then on, I made a deliberate effort never to be alone with her. It sounds ridiculous, because it was my damn house, but I started planning my evenings around Emily's schedule. If Sarah went shopping and Mark was working, suddenly I had something to organize in the garage. If Emily came outside while I was working there, I'd find an excuse to drive to the hardware store. I started fishing more often too. Mark even joked about it one Sunday. "Dad, you planning to live on that lake now?" I laughed and told him I was enjoying the quiet. Sarah noticed too. She'd ask why I kept disappearing. I always gave her some harmless answer, because every time I considered telling her the truth, I imagined the explosion afterward. Mark was already exhausted. Their house was torn apart. They had debt. Sarah adored having our son home again. I kept telling myself I could handle Emily until they moved out. All I had to do was keep my distance. I didn't understand yet that Emily had already noticed exactly what I was doing. Her next move was smarter. She stopped coming after me and started working on Sarah. Suddenly they were together constantly. Emily began helping with dinner, going grocery shopping with her, helping her choose plants for the backyard, even sitting with her for hours drinking coffee and talking. Sarah loved it. We'd never had a daughter, and I could see how much she enjoyed finally having another woman around the house. "She's such a sweetheart when you actually get to know her," Sarah told me one night in bed. I nearly laughed at the irony, but nothing about it felt funny. A week later, Sarah said, "I hope they don't rush back to that cottage. It's nice having them here." I stared at the ceiling and said, "Eventually, they need their own place." Sarah immediately turned toward me. "Why are you suddenly so eager to get rid of them?" I said I wasn't. She studied my face for a moment, then rolled over. That conversation stayed in my head because it was the first time I realized Emily wasn't just trying to get close to my wife. She was making herself valuable to her. Then the questions started. Sarah would casually ask why I was spending so much time in the garage. Another night, she asked whether something was bothering me. I told her no. "Emily says you've seemed cold lately," she said. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I looked across the table. Emily was sitting beside Mark with the most innocent expression I'd ever seen. "Did she?" I asked. Emily shrugged. "I just said you seemed stressed," Sarah added, "and you're always disappearing somewhere." Mark barely noticed because he was half asleep over his dinner. I looked at Emily, and she held my eyes for maybe 2 seconds before smiling down at her plate. That was when I understood what she was doing. She was building a story around me before I ever told mine. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became suspicious in a way she'd never been during 30 years of marriage. If I came home late, she asked where I'd been. If I went fishing, she joked about whether there was really a lake involved. They sounded like jokes, but I knew my wife. There was something underneath them. Emily had planted just enough doubt to make Sarah watch me differently. And then one Thursday evening, Sarah mentioned that her sister needed help for a few days. "I'll probably leave Saturday morning and come back Monday," she said. My chest tightened immediately. I looked toward Mark. He was checking his work schedule on his phone. "I'm at the warehouse Saturday night anyway," he said. Across the table, Emily slowly lifted her glass and looked straight at me. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. For the first time since she'd moved in, I felt genuinely afraid of being alone in my own house. Saturday morning came way too fast. Sarah packed a small suitcase after breakfast, while I wandered around the house pretending everything was normal. I almost told her 3 different times. Once when she was standing in our bedroom, looking for her charger. Once when she kissed me goodbye. And again when she was already halfway through the front door. Every time I stopped myself. What could I say without sounding insane? "Your daughter-in-law has been coming on to me." But I kept it secret for weeks. Emily had already been telling Sarah I was acting strange. I could almost hear how that conversation would go. Sarah would have questions. Mark would get dragged into it. Emily would deny everything. And suddenly 4 people would be screaming while she stood there crying. I needed something more than my word against hers. So I kissed Sarah and said, "Drive safe." Emily came into the hallway right then and hugged her. "Don't worry about Joseph," she said with this sweet little laugh. "I'll make sure he behaves himself." Sarah laughed. I didn't. Emily looked over Sarah's shoulder directly at me. Mark left later that afternoon. He looked exhausted before his shift even started. I was in the garage when he came out wearing his warehouse jacket, carrying an energy drink. "You okay, Dad?" he asked. Apparently, I looked worse than I thought. "Yeah, why?" He shrugged. "You've been weird all day." For 1 second, I nearly told him everything right there. Then I looked at his face. Dark circles under his eyes. Grease still under one fingernail from the workshop. Shoulders hanging from lack of sleep. I couldn't dump an accusation about his wife on him 5 minutes before a 12-hour shift, when I still had nothing to prove it. I slapped his shoulder and said, "Just tired." He smiled. "You? Getting old, man." I told him to get the hell out of my garage, and he laughed as he walked toward his truck. I stood there watching his taillights disappear down the driveway. That stupid little conversation still bothers me. He trusted everybody inside that house. Me, his mother, his wife. He had no idea that by leaving for work, he was walking straight out of the middle of a mess that was about to blow up his marriage. I stayed in the garage until after 11. Emily never came out. That almost made it worse because I kept expecting her to. Finally, I locked everything, went inside, and found the downstairs completely dark. Her bedroom door upstairs was closed. I told myself maybe I'd been wrong about what that look at breakfast meant. I checked the front door twice, went into my bedroom, and locked that door too. Yeah, I locked my own bedroom door because of my son's wife. Try explaining that sentence without feeling ridiculous. I lay awake for maybe an hour before finally falling asleep. Then, sometime around 2, I felt the blanket moving. At first I thought I'd kicked it off. Then it moved again, slowly, deliberately. I opened my eyes and saw Emily beside the bed. Before I could sit up, she climbed onto the mattress and settled across my thighs. She was wearing almost nothing except thin silk lingerie. "What the hell are you doing?" I whispered. She put a finger against my lips. "Mark's working. Sarah's gone. Nobody's coming home." She leaned toward my ear. "I'm so tired of that boy, Joseph. Let's just do what we've both been thinking about for a month." I shoved myself backward against the headboard and grabbed her wrist when she reached for my chest. "Get off me." She laughed quietly. "Stop pretending." I said it louder. "Emily, get the hell off me." This time she moved, but she didn't leave. She sat at the edge of the bed, like I was the one behaving strangely. I pulled the blanket over myself and stared at her. "Are you out of your damn mind?" "That's my son." She rolled her eyes. "Exactly. Your son, not you." I felt my jaw tighten. She kept going. "Mark is basically a kid. He works all day, comes home smelling like a warehouse, eats, showers, sleeps. That's my marriage now." I said, "He's doing that for you." She laughed. "No, he's doing it because he's obsessed with proving he's a man." Then she looked straight at me. "You don't have to prove it." I pointed toward the door. "Leave right now, or I'm calling Mark." Her expression changed instantly, not fear, something colder. "And tell him what?" she asked. "That I came in here." I said, "I'll tell him everything. The pool, the bathroom, the kitchen. Tonight, all of it." She stared at me for a second, and then started smiling. "Okay." That answer threw me. I said, "You think this is funny?" Emily stood up and folded her arms. "No, I'm just wondering which version he'll believe." I didn't understand what she meant until she grabbed the strap of her nightgown and pulled it sideways. "Maybe I tell him you've been watching me for weeks. Maybe I tell Sarah you cornered me when she wasn't home." My mouth went dry. Emily stepped closer. "Maybe I rip this, scream, put a couple bruises on myself, and tell everybody you dragged me into your bedroom." I remember actually saying, "Holy shit." She shrugged. "Who do you think they believe? The crying 20-something girl or the 55-year-old man who conveniently waited weeks to tell anyone?" That was the first moment I understood how bad my silence had been. Every time I'd tried to protect Mark from drama, I'd given Emily another weapon. She knew there were no witnesses. She knew Sarah had already noticed me acting differently. Worse, she'd helped create that suspicion herself. I wanted to throw her out of the house right then, but my brain was finally moving faster than my anger. If I exploded, she controlled what happened next, so I forced my shoulders to relax. "Fine," I said. She blinked. "What?" I looked down, like I couldn't meet her eyes. "Fine, you win." She watched me carefully. "Seriously?" I nodded. "But not tonight. Not like this. Mark could come home early. Sarah could call. I'm not risking that." Her smile slowly returned. I hated that smile more than I can explain. "So when?" she asked. I waited a few seconds before answering because I needed her to believe I was ashamed, scared, and finally giving in. "Monday, 7 in the evening, my bedroom. Sarah will still be away, and I'll make sure Mark isn't here." Emily walked closer and touched my chin. Every muscle in my body wanted to pull away, but I stayed still. "See?" she whispered. "That wasn't so hard." Then she turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back and said, 7 exactly. Don't make me wait." The door clicked shut behind her. I sat there without moving until I heard her bedroom door close down the hall. Then I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped it. I didn't call anyone yet. At 2 in the morning, panic would only create questions I couldn't answer safely. Instead, I opened my contacts, looked at Mark's name, then Sarah's, and finally understood exactly what I had to do. Emily wanted my family to choose between her story and mine. Fine, I wasn't going to ask them to choose. I was going to make sure they heard her story directly from her own mouth. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I sat against the headboard with the bedroom light on, replaying everything Emily had said and trying to find holes in the plan forming in my head. Part of me wanted to call Mark immediately and tell him to come home. Another part wanted to wake the whole damn neighborhood and throw Emily out before sunrise. But every angry version ended the same way. She denied it. Worse, she could follow through on that threat. By 6 in the morning, I decided there would be no confrontation without witnesses. I showered, got dressed, and went downstairs. Emily appeared around 8, wearing sweatpants and one of Mark's shirts, looking completely relaxed. She poured coffee and asked, "Sleep well?" I looked at her and said, "Not really." She smiled into her cup. "You'll sleep better Monday." I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself from reacting. Instead, I nodded once and walked outside. The second the garage door closed behind me, I pulled out my phone. Mark was still finishing his warehouse shift, so I waited until I knew he'd be on break. When he answered, machinery was humming behind him. "Dad, everything okay?" I deliberately let my voice shake. Honestly, I didn't have to fake much. "Mark, I need your help Monday." He immediately became serious. "What happened?" I said. "I can't explain it over the phone." There was a pause. "Dad, are you sick?" I told him no. But he kept asking questions. Had somebody threatened me? Was Mom okay? Had something happened with the business? Finally, I said, "Listen to me. Monday, 6:55 in the evening. Come home quietly. Use your key. Don't call out when you enter. Just go straight upstairs to my bedroom." He said, "What the hell are you talking about?" I repeated that I couldn't explain yet. Mark sounded genuinely scared. "Do I need to call the cops?" "No." Then I added, "And don't tell Emily you're coming." The line went silent. I knew that sentence had landed. "Why?" he asked. I closed my eyes. "Please trust me for 2 more days." He breathed heavily into the phone, then finally said, "Okay, 6:55. Calling Sarah was worse. She answered cheerfully from her sister's place, and hearing her voice almost made me confess everything. "Hey, handsome, missing me already?" she said. I forced out a laugh, then told her I needed her home Monday evening. Her tone changed immediately. "Joseph, what's wrong?" I gave her basically the same instructions. "Come at 6:55, don't announce yourself. Use your key, and come directly upstairs." She started firing questions at me so quickly I could barely answer. "Are you hurt? Did somebody break in? Is Mark okay?" I told her everyone was physically fine. "Then tell me what happened." I said, "Sarah, if I explain this over the phone, you're going to think I've lost my mind. I need you to see something yourself." She went quiet. Then she asked, "Does this have something to do with Emily?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't said her name. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah hesitated. "Because things have been weird between you two." I almost told her right then, but stopped. "Monday, please." After a long silence, she agreed. The rest of Sunday was miserable. Mark came home after his shift and slept most of the day. Emily behaved like the perfect wife when he woke up. She made him breakfast, even though it was nearly 3 in the afternoon, kissed his forehead, and asked about work. I sat across the kitchen watching the performance while Mark ate. At one point, he looked at me, and our eyes met. I could tell he wanted to ask about the phone call, but Emily was standing 3 feet away. He didn't. She noticed the look between us anyway. "What?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Nothing." Emily looked at me next. I picked up my coffee and drank it. For a second, I worried she knew. Then she smiled and started talking about the renovation. Somehow, that was even more disturbing. She could threaten to destroy my life at 2 in the morning and make pancakes for my son the next afternoon, without missing a beat. Monday dragged like a week. I went to work because staying home would have driven me insane. Around noon, Emily texted me for the first time privately. "Still 7?" I stared at the message for almost a minute before answering, "Yes." 3 dots appeared immediately. Good. That was it. I took a screenshot and saved it, though I knew it proved almost nothing by itself. At 4:30, I left the job site and drove home. Mark had arranged to leave the workshop early without telling Emily. Sarah had told her sister she needed to come back for something important. Emily thought both of them would be gone. Around 6, she disappeared upstairs. I stayed in the living room, listening to every sound above me. A drawer opening, footsteps, water running. At 6:45, I went into my bedroom and put on a bathrobe over my clothes. I wanted the scene to look exactly like whatever fantasy she had built in her head. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the clock. At 6:50, my mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if Mark was late? What if Sarah walked in loudly? What if Emily sensed something and backed out? At 6:54, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Then they stopped. Not Emily. Too heavy. A few seconds later came the faintest click from downstairs. The front door. My pulse jumped. Someone had entered. Then another tiny sound, like a shoe brushing the wall near the stairs. I looked at the clock. 6:55. They were here. I didn't know whether Mark and Sarah had arrived together or seconds apart, but I knew at least one of them was inside. Then my bedroom door opened. Emily stepped in, holding a glass of wine. She wore a loose silk robe, barely closed in front, and her hair was done like she was going somewhere expensive. She shut the door behind her and smiled. "You actually listened." I said nothing. She walked toward me slowly, placed the wine on my nightstand, and loosened the robe. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure she could hear it. Emily let the robe fall open, came right up to the bed, and leaned toward me. "Relax, Joseph," she whispered. "Nobody's coming home." Behind her, somewhere just outside the bedroom, the floorboard in the hallway gave one quiet creak. Emily didn't hear the floorboard. Or if she did, she assumed it was the house settling. She was too focused on me. She let the robe slip from her shoulders and dropped it beside the bed, then sat across my lap, like she'd done 2 nights earlier. Every instinct in me screamed to push her away, but I needed another 10 seconds, maybe 5. I had no idea exactly where Mark and Sarah were standing. Emily put both hands around my neck and laughed softly. "Look at you. You're terrified." I swallowed and said, "Maybe this isn't a good idea." Her smile widened. "Don't start that again." She leaned closer. "Your stupid little son is finally working his shift. Your old wife is stuck in another city, and nobody is going to interrupt us." I stared past her toward the bedroom door. Emily grabbed my chin and turned my face back toward hers. "Hey, look at me." Then she whispered, "Kiss me." I didn't move. Her expression tightened. "Joseph, I swear to God, if you chicken out again..." The bedroom door flew open so hard, it hit the wall. Emily jumped off me with a scream and spun around. Mark stood in the doorway with Sarah directly behind him. Nobody spoke. I mean nobody. For maybe 3 or 4 seconds, the entire house went dead silent. Emily grabbed the sheet from the bed and pulled it against herself. Mark looked at the robe on the floor, then at Emily, then at me. His face had gone completely white. Sarah's mouth was slightly open. I stood up immediately and tightened my bathrobe. "Mark," I started, but he lifted one hand without looking at me. Don't. Emily finally found her voice. Mark, wait. This isn't what it looks like. I swear, when she said that, something almost broke inside me, because it was such a stupid, predictable sentence. Mark stared at her. I heard you. Emily shook her head fast. No, you didn't understand. He said, you called me your stupid little son. His voice was quiet. That was worse than yelling. Emily looked toward Sarah. Sarah, please. Joseph set me up. Sarah's expression changed so fast I barely recognized her. He set you up? Emily nodded, desperately. Yes. He's been acting weird with me for weeks. He told me to come in here. I thought he needed to talk. Sarah looked down at the silk robe on the floor, and then at the sheet Emily was clutching around herself. You dress like that? For conversations? Emily opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Then she pointed at me. He wanted this. He's been staring at me since we moved in. I felt Mark's eyes move toward me. For one horrible second, I thought everything was about to collapse anyway. Then I said, tell them what you told me Saturday night. Emily froze. I don't know what you mean, I said. Tell them what you said you'd do if I told Mark. Her face changed. Mark noticed it too. What happened Saturday? He asked. Emily immediately said, nothing. I answered, she came into this bedroom around 2 a.m. while you were at work. She got into my bed. When I told her I was calling you, she said she'd tear her clothes, bruise herself, and accuse me of attacking her. Sarah covered her mouth. Mark stared at his wife, like he was looking at a stranger. Emily started shaking her head. He's lying. He's lying because you caught him. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. Emily flinched. I opened her message from earlier and held it toward Mark. She texted me today asking if 7 was still happening. Mark read it. His jaw tightened. Emily said, that proves nothing. I nodded. You're right, it doesn't. That's why they're here. She looked from Mark to Sarah and finally seemed to understand the whole thing. I hadn't invited her into a secret bedroom meeting. I'd invited her into a room with 2 witnesses waiting outside. Sarah moved first. She walked toward Emily, stopped about a foot away and said, you sat in my kitchen. You went shopping with me. You listened to me talk about my marriage. Emily said, Sarah, I'm sorry. Sarah's voice rose. You told me my husband was acting suspicious. Emily tried to interrupt, but Sarah kept going. You had me questioning a man I've been married to for 30 years? While you were trying to get into his bed? Emily said, it wasn't like that. Sarah slapped her once across the face. The sound cracked through the room. I stepped forward immediately. Sarah! She backed away on her own, breathing hard. Emily stared at her in shock, one hand against her cheek. Mark still hadn't moved. Finally he said, get dressed. Emily looked at him. Baby. He shook his head. Don't call me that. Get dressed. The next 20 minutes were ugly, but not in the way people probably imagine. Mark didn't punch walls or smash furniture. He walked into their room, pulled her suitcase from the closet, and started putting her clothes inside, not folding them, just putting them in. Emily followed him, crying now, switching between apologizing and blaming me. He manipulated this whole thing, Mark. Think about it. Mark kept packing. I heard you. She grabbed his arm. I was angry. I said stupid things. He pulled his arm away. You were sitting on my father's lap. Emily shouted, because he told me to come. Mark finally turned around. After you threatened him. That shut her up. Sarah stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, while I stayed several feet back, because I didn't want to give Emily any opportunity to twist another second of what was happening. Mark zipped the suitcase and carried it downstairs. Emily followed, wrapped in the same robe, still crying. Outside, Rain had started hitting the windows. She stopped near the front door and said, "Where am I supposed to go?" Mark took out his phone. "Your mom's." She stared at him. "You're throwing me out?" He looked exhausted rather than angry. "Yeah." Then, almost unbelievably, he opened a rideshare app. "I'm getting you a car." Emily looked at me one last time, and the sadness disappeared from her face. There was pure hatred there now. "You ruined my marriage." Before I could answer, Mark said, "No, you did." He set her suitcase beside the door, then walked back upstairs to collect the rest of her things. I stayed in the hallway, listening to the rain, and realized my hands had finally stopped shaking. The car took about 12 minutes to arrive, and those were probably the longest 12 minutes of Mark's life. Emily stood near the front door with her suitcase, while Sarah sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. I stayed by the counter because I honestly didn't know where else to put myself. Every few minutes, Emily tried again. First she cried, then she apologized, then she blamed stress, then she blamed Mark's work schedule. "You're never home," she told him. "I've basically been alone since we moved here." Mark was standing by the window watching for the car. He didn't even turn around. "I was working 2 jobs to fix our house." Emily said, "I didn't ask you to do that." That finally made him look at her. "You wanted the house." She crossed her arms. "We both wanted it." Mark laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. "Yeah. And apparently, while I was killing myself trying to pay for it, you were complaining to my dad that I wasn't enough of a man for you." Emily started crying again. "I made a mistake." Mark shook his head. "A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. This was a plan." When the car finally pulled into the driveway, Mark carried her suitcase outside himself. It was raining hard enough that he came back in with his shirt soaked across the shoulders. Emily stood in the doorway for a few seconds, like she expected somebody to stop her. Nobody did. Then she looked at Sarah and said, "I really did love you." Sarah stared at her and answered, "Then I'd hate to see what you do to people you don't like." Emily looked at me last. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. She stepped outside and slammed the door behind her. Through the window, I watched her drag the suitcase toward the car, while trying to keep the robe closed with one hand. Mark had packed some normal clothes for her, by the way. She was just too angry to change. I'm mentioning that because whenever I tell this story, somebody imagines we literally threw a half-naked woman into the rain. We didn't. Mark even paid for the damn ride to her mother's house. That's my son. His marriage was collapsing in front of him, and he still made sure she had somewhere safe to go. The second the car disappeared, Mark sat down on the bottom stair and put his face in his hands. That hurt worse to watch than anything Emily had done. I sat beside him, but didn't touch him at first. After maybe a minute, he said, "How long?" I knew exactly what he meant. "About a month." His head came up. "A month?" I nodded. "Nothing happened, Mark. But yeah, the weird behavior started about a month ago." His face tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was. The question I'd been asking myself every day. I told him the truth. "Because you were working 16-hour days. Because I didn't have proof. Because I thought I could keep avoiding her until you moved out. And because I was scared you'd think I'd done something to encourage it." Mark looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, I would have believed you." I looked down at my hands. "I know that now." He shook his head. "No, you should have known it then." He was right. I didn't argue. Sarah came over and sat on Mark's other side. For a while, the three of us just sat there on the stairs like idiots while the rain hammered the roof. Then Sarah looked across Mark at me and said, And you. I knew immediately I was in trouble. What? She pointed at me. You let me spend weeks thinking you were sneaking around because you couldn't open your mouth and tell your wife what was happening. I said, I was trying to protect everybody. She gave me a look that could have melted steel. How'd that work out? Mark actually laughed. Just one little laugh. I started laughing too, mostly because I was exhausted. And then Sarah tried not to smile and failed. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before Mark got quiet again. But those 10 seconds mattered. They were the first sign that the three of us were still a family after the craziest night we'd ever had. The divorce process started almost immediately. Emily tried calling Mark constantly for the first few days. Then came long messages, apologies, explanations, and promises. Mark read some of them and ignored most. Eventually, he told her communication needed to go through the proper channels unless it involved collecting belongings or dealing with their property. Their cottage became another problem. Neither of them could comfortably carry everything alone, and the renovation was still unfinished. Mark stopped taking warehouse shifts for a while because I told him I'd rather help with the renovation than watch him destroy himself. For once, he didn't argue much. We started spending evenings at the cottage together, just me and him, tearing out bad drywall, replacing damaged framing, fixing the electrical mess. Sometimes we talked about Emily. Most nights we didn't. He needed something normal to do with his hands, and honestly, so did I. A couple weeks later, we were replacing cabinets when Mark suddenly said, "You know what the worst part is?" I put down the drill. He said, "I kept thinking I was failing her because I wasn't making enough money. That's why I took the warehouse job." I told him, "You weren't failing anybody." He shrugged. "Feels pretty stupid now." I said, "Working for your family isn't stupid. Trusting your wife isn't stupid either." He looked at me and said, "You practicing speeches now, old man?" I threw a work glove at him. He laughed and went back to the cabinet. That was more like my son. Not completely okay, but coming back. He eventually quit the warehouse job and went back to one normal schedule. The renovation took longer, but nobody cared anymore. We finished the kitchen together, rebuilt the bathroom floor, and replaced almost every piece of wiring that previous idiot had touched. Sarah and I had some repairing to do too. She wasn't angry because Emily had tried something with me. She was angry because I'd carried it alone and let Emily manipulate the space between us. I promised her that if anything even remotely similar ever happened again, she'd hear about it immediately. Sarah said, "Good, because I'm too old for another secret bedroom operation." Then she looked at me and added, "Although I have to admit, Joseph, 30 years of marriage, and I never realized you were apparently this irresistible." I told her to shut up. She laughed for about 5 minutes. That became the family joke eventually. Every time a woman came to the house, Mark would say, "Dad, behave yourself." Sarah once hid her expensive perfume before her friend visited and told me, "I'm not taking chances." Very funny. Apparently, surviving attempted blackmail earns you absolutely no respect in your own home. It's been long enough now that we can laugh about parts of it, but I still think about that first night sometimes. Not Emily sitting on my bed, the moment afterward, when I decided not to tell anyone. That was my biggest mistake. I thought silence would protect my son, my wife, and our family. Instead, it gave Emily room to control the story. If she hadn't gotten arrogant enough to threaten me directly, I don't know how ugly things could have become. Mark's doing better now. Sarah still gives me hell. I'm still helping finish that damn cottage, because apparently retirement isn't happening for me anytime soon. And yes, Mark now jokes that whenever he brings another woman home someday, he's showing her the front door first, so she knows exactly where it is. So I've got to ask, if you were me, what would you have done? Would you have told your wife and son the second the first weird thing happened, even without proof, would you have kicked Emily out immediately after that threat and taken your chances? Or would you have done what I did and made damn sure the two people who mattered most heard the truth straight from her own mouth? Because looking back, I'm still not sure whether my little family trap was smart or completely insane. I only know one thing. Monday at 6:55 was the last time anybody in my family ever wondered whether I'd been imagining the whole thing.